recording. An interesting thing this year, what does it mean to be a local group? We had Phoebe serving out, we had board members serving out of state, and people presenting from other countries. Really proud to have Sakina, my mentee from MIMPA last year, who's still stuck in Afghanistan, and the word is there's some way out soon, but that hasn't happened, and they've clamped down even worse with the burqa requirement and stay at home, and it's horrible. But anyway, the question of what does it mean to be a local group when people are participating from Alaska and other local groups are promoting their programs to other local groups. So where does local groups end? And SIAP again is very interesting going forward. And a year ago, Jordan guest spoke and presented our expertise on mentoring to a huddle of local IO leaders nationally. And they have looked to us as the second oldest to Metro, which is pushing 100 years.
And no. Sarah.
Yeah, Sarah, yes, Sarah, it was a thank you, was on that, the presentation. Thank you, Sarah, yes, as a foundress of the mentoring program, and one of our founders in the whole program a year ago. So we've been contributing to the expertise of other local groups around the country, as the second oldest now at 30 some years ourselves. So our finances are at a strong kind of historic high because we didn't spend a lot of money because we weren't together breaking bread. So we go into next year with good money in the bank, and I believe Randy, our new treasurer, I don't see his face now, but was on the call. And so, Dr. Dana, do you have any opening comments before we turn it over to Roger for the program?
No, I'm excited to be taking over next year, and I hope we'll have an interesting lineup and a good season. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
Great. The bylaws do require member observation of the slate. So how are you going to handle that, Dana? You got a good plan for that?
I'm just going to send out an email over the summer and ask people if they have any problems with it.
Good hybrid solution.
Yeah, that's great. That's a good one. And we're very fortunate because we're, what, 2/3 staffed already for next year, but still plenty of roles. Is that about right? Something like that. So the momentum is there, and that's what the local groups really struggle with is succession and sustaining, and we just have not had that problem. So Roger, please.
Yeah, I had a couple comments prepared, and Craig gave me some slides ahead of time, but seeing as, you know, we're already 10 minutes past and there aren't too many of us, I think it might just be easier to hand it over to Craig and give it to y'all to dive into the presentation here. If that's all right with you, Craig?
Sure.
Yeah. Only thing I would want to say is Craig's been very, very responsive and very patient. And I think we've been corresponding on this for well over a year at this point. I'm just really looking forward to future Korn Ferry and MPA collaboration because they're doing great work.
Well, thank you, Roger. Same to you. I feel like you've been responsive and patient as we shifted topics a couple times, but in January we arrived at this one. So here's what I'm going to do, Korn Ferry team and Joy. Why don't we let's just do some quick introductions and then back to me. So my name's Craig Sneltjes. I am a partner at Korn Ferry. I work in a practice called Assessment and Succession, and the reason that I see the St. Thomas campus is we have an office in downtown Minneapolis that and I happen to look south. And I'm also the office managing partner for our Minneapolis office, which is about 250 people are associated with this group. And really looking forward to kind of diving into this topic of neurodiversity. And Dana, as you say, let's, a smaller group, we can kind of keep it informal. So Mary, and then Sarah, and then Joy.
Sounds good. Hi, everybody. I'm Mary Starke, also a partner in our Minneapolis office, and I sit in the same group that Craig does in Assessment and Succession. So nice to see everyone this evening.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be joining you this evening. I'm Sarah Hezlett. I'm a Senior Director of Assessment Science. I sit in the Minneapolis office, but in a slightly different group called the Korn Ferry Institute. And one of the Institute's roles is to do research, and My role is particularly focused on assessment-related research, and it is a delight when I have the opportunity to partner with Craig and Mary at Korn Ferry, and also this evening, and also with Joy.
My name is Joy Kieffer, and this is actually my second career. As I said, I started in education and was a high school English teacher. And then early on in my career, I found that I was teaching a lot of kids that had challenges in the classroom, behavioral disorders. And so I decided to go back to school and get my master's degree in working with youth with emotional and behavioral disorders, which happened to coincide actually at the time that the DSM, the first DSM, came out with the autism spectrum disorders. And I was so elated to discover that many of the kids that I was working with were really kids who are on the autism spectrum. And once I understood them, they were really performing. So that's my connection then to the rest of my career. I became a special ed director and worked 20 years in that, and then took early retirement because I had a son who had been in the military and came back. And to make a long, complicated story short, he suffered an accident playing rugby and was incredibly disabled after he came out of that accident. And when he passed away in 2017, I had already started working with Mindshift as their employment services person in the Minneapolis area. And then once he had passed away, my life even opened up more, and I decided I wasn't really ready to go anywhere else. So I started working with Mindshift and ultimately became the executive director. And that's how I'm here today.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Joy and Sarah and Mary. And I got to give a shout out to Sarah, who is a new PSYOP fellow as of about a month ago. So congratulations to Sarah.
Thank you.
All right. All right, remind me how where the button I click to go to full screen. Somebody know?
Are you on a dual monitor?
Yeah,
I think under display settings, you need to switch.
I know it. That's what I dialed in early and made sure this worked, and now that display settings isn't. Hang on here.
Oh, we can see it
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
up at the top. And yep.
There we go. Good. All right. Well, thanks. Good to be with all of you. And it's always fun to collaborate with my colleagues, Sarah and Mary, and Joy has felt like a colleague over the last few years as we've gotten to know Mindshift and work on this topic of neurodiversity. If some of you were at PSYOP, part of this, I say a portion of this presentation was done at PSYOP back in April. Mary and Sarah and a cast of others did a session on neurodiversity in the workplace. If you were there, you certainly see some familiar elements of it, but today with Joy's participation and my 2 cents, it certainly will be a different kind of presentation. You know, and because I wasn't at PSYOP, I was able to watch the presentation, which we've all done now on Zoom, which is great. And you've maybe seen there's a feature in Zoom where, in addition to listening to the recording, something, I don't know if it's AI or a machine or software, transcribes all of what the presenters are saying. And one of the words that kept getting used by the PSYOP presentation, and we'll use it today, is neurodivergent. Neurodivergent. So somebody with autism might be considered neurodivergent. Well, the software didn't really pick, it didn't know that word, so it turned it into 2 words, nerdvergent, which was interesting. And so I want to put a little disclaimer out there that Korn Ferry is not doing any research into that particular demographic. It's neurodivergent. So in case you're watching this afterwards and that comes up, there's the disclaimer. All right. All I have to say about this slide, I just noticed a minute ago, is I apparently only have one sport coat. So, all right. Hey, a quick word on Korn Ferry. I think some of you on the call are pretty familiar with Korn Ferry, but some may not be. So I know this is a busy slide. Focus your attention on those 5 columns in the middle. So Korn Ferry is about 9,000 employees around the globe, and a vast majority of what we do falls in those 5 categories. So our consulting clients would typically do one or more, sometimes all of these with us. So organizational strategy on the left, we sometimes think of that as a group that kind of helps a company activate their strategy with people. Total rewards, assessment and succession, as we talked about, that's where Mary and I sit. And we have quite a presence in Minneapolis in assessment and succession. A lot of IO psychologists here in this practice. You may know Korn Ferry as an executive search firm, talent acquisition. So certainly we do executive search, but we do lots of other kind of help organizations do other kinds of recruitment as well. And then finally, leadership development, where lots of, there's remarkably high amount of leadership development going on during COVID. We're not exactly sure why. And in Minneapolis, we do a fair amount of what we would call executive development. Just we have a kind of a group of experts here who work with pretty senior people. All right, that's the overview of Korn Ferry. About 3 years ago, I joined the volunteer board of Mindshift, and Joy will talk a little bit more about Mindshift, but in very high level terms, and she might correct me, Mindshift started about 10 years ago and worked to recruit, train, and deploy people on the autism spectrum into good jobs. Hopefully better jobs, oftentimes better jobs than they might get on their own. And Mindshift has grown to also involve more consulting to organizations. So about, I don't know, it was maybe 6 months ago, I was in at the Mindshift board meeting. It was in the middle of the morning. And before the board meeting, I had to do 2 interviews for open positions at Korn Ferry. So 2 different positions. So I was in the world of behavioral interviews. So tell me about a time when you had to be courageous. Tell me about a time when you had to influence somebody. Tell me about a time, you had to simplify something that was complex. All these kind of behavioral questions. This is something I've taught in my career. I've done hundreds of interviews. I took my notes on the two interviews, and then I dialed into the Mindshift board meeting. In that particular board meeting, we heard a lot about, we were reminded of something that we all know on this call, and maybe some of us know it a little more acutely, which is quite often people with autism don't interview well, right? We just know that because we have a standard for what a good interview looks like, and we're often looking for things like emotional intelligence and gregariousness and persuasiveness and strong communication and strong networking. And we know that can be a struggle for people who are neurodiverse. So I'm in the board meeting and I'm all fired up about boy, this is kind of, a good reminder of this and what can we do at Korn Ferry about this? What can we do with Mindshift? The board meeting ends. And then I go back to my notes from those interviews that morning, and I'm struck by some of the words that I wrote in my interview notes that I'm going to, turn into our recruiter. This person, this candidate had low energy, right? The person might be rigid versus open versus agile. This other person, I noticed that they build rapport quickly. I got the sense that they would know how to influence. And it really hit me that are these requirements that are really central to the job? And I think for one job it was, and maybe for the other one it wasn't. And I got to thinking, could I have been interviewing somebody who would be considered neurodiverse? And And why didn't I ask, some questions like, how do you work best? How do you learn best? Tell me about the environment where you flourish. Tell me about the type of environment where you might struggle. These are questions, although we know that an interview alone is imperfect, that might start to get at more of what people on the autism spectrum or the neurodivergent which we might uncover a bit more in an interview or help them along. All right. So I point out this little story to just remind myself of the biases that we bring into interviewing, but not just interviewing. We bring biases to the workplace when it comes to working with and being effective with people that are neurodiverse. So we're going to dig in a bit today, not just to interviewing, but other elements of the kind of the employee life cycle with respect to this population. The thing that keeps coming to my mind is this little phrase that I need to think differently about people who think differently. I need to kind of adjust my mindset for people who kind of see and feel and experience the world differently than I do, right? And that's kind of a non-academic definition of neurodiverse, people who see and feel and experience the world a bit differently than so-called neurotypical people. Okay, a few statistics here, and then I'm going to turn it over to Sarah. In some of our research, we would say that roughly 20% of the population is neurodiverse, meaning there's sort of an atypical neurological structure, connectivity, or function. Okay, so Sarah will talk about autism, ADHD, and dyslexia, but certainly it's a bigger set than just that. I find this to be sort of a sobering statistic that 29% of people in this population are employed, and so there's a big number that's not employed. And one of the I know the founder of Mindshift talks very compellingly about when he saw these statistics, and he has a son who has autism, really got his attention, and he moved into action. People in this population are 18 times more likely to be disciplined, and we can kind of imagine why. Think of how often in the workplace, somebody doesn't communicate well, and that's viewed a certain way. And then finally, 60%. 60 people in this population are 60% more likely to lose their jobs, and there could be a variety of reasons for that. But I think of this as sort of somewhere wrapped up in here is the problem statement. And the next, Sarah and Joy and Mary are here to sort of help us understand this problem statement a bit more, and certainly to be more hopeful about how we can be more effective in working with this population. All right, quick chat. Now, if you're at an organization, I don't know how many are students and how many are at organizations, but if you could put something in the chat, does your organization have an approach or a program that addresses neurodiversity? And if so, just, one quick comment on what's going well. And so why don't we do this? I'll kind of monitor the chat, or Roger can help me monitor the chat, and we may come back to this. So I am going to turn it over to Sarah.
Thanks, Craig. I'll just say a few words to kick off my presentation, which is about neurodiversity recruitment and assessment. First, I just want to mention that I'm presenting on behalf of a great group of colleagues who helped contribute to the research that I'm going to be sharing in this particular presentation. I also want to share that my interest in inclusion, which I see neurodiversity as part of being inclusive in the workplace, really was sparked and started as a kid, long before I knew what a workplace was. It was because my wonderful sister, who is hearing impaired, I watched her struggle with a lot of challenges around stereotyping and stigmatization. And then as an adult, my interest in neurodiversity also was sparked and fueled more on the personal side than the professional side. And that's because I work with some great colleagues who identify as neurodiverse. I have family members and friends who either formally or informally have been diagnosed as neurodiverse. And so I had some awareness or background of this topic from that, but it really came on to my professional radar scope probably about a year ago when we started getting some interesting questions into our internal mailbox where we try to help answer questions for folks like Craig and Mary who are working with clients. Can you advance the slide, Craig? We started getting what I would say infrequently asked questions. The frequently asked one we try to equip people with answers to from the get-go, but we started getting questions we hadn't seen before, like, I'd like the neurodiversity accommodations, and I'd like my assessment debriefed through the lens of neurodiversity. And so we were able to address and help the people answering these specific questions, but it also gave us an appetite to know more, to turn to the science and use evidence-based practice. And so we started this project, part of which is I'm going to share what we learned today. Stepping back, it may be helpful for us to have a kind of shared mental model to think about the hiring process. Most of hiring involves a hiring organization, which I've represented at the top of the slide, and job applicants applying for roles. And if they're hired, they become employees. Consulting firms like Korn Ferry can often help with that process. And advocacy and support organizations such as Mindshift also are engaged and involved in contributing the process. And that process really starts with the design of jobs. What are the tasks? What are the accountabilities? What do we want people do on the job? And what are some of the knowledge, skills, attributes, and other characteristics people need to do with that job? That information fuels a job description, which is then the kind of starting point for a lot of job applications. That job application and hiring process can also often involve assessment. And the hiring process itself can often involve some probationary periods or some negotiation about what are going to be your benefits and things like that, and then move into onboarding and training and development. The project that we undertook, obviously this is a huge process and we felt like we needed to start somewhere. So we started looking at job application and assessment for a subset of people who identify as neurodiverse and try to understand what was known about those groups and the job application process and parts of the assessment process that we could use and apply in our practices. Craig, can you move on to the next slide? So more formally, we really wanted to understand how individuals who identify as neurodiverse are affected or what barriers they face in the application process. And on average, how do individuals who identify as neurodiverse perform on assessments commonly used for talent management? I want to say that in this presentation, I'm including interviewing, personality, and cognitive ability testing. And we did focus solely on 3 neurodiverse groups: autism, ADHD, and dyslexia. As Craig mentioned, there's many other groups who may identify as neurodiverse, and we picked these 3 as they are some of the larger groups and often mentioned in some of the defining characteristics of, here's examples of folks who are neurodiverse. To give you a preview of what we found in a really interesting review article published last year, Doyle and McDowell concluded that there's insufficient academic inquiry into diversity as work. They characterized their paper as an empty review because they found so few articles that were actually published in the traditional applied psychology literature, such as JAP, personnel psychology, industrial organizational psychology. And so in some ways, although this is a really pretty big topic. I think if most people went to an advisor and said, hey, I want to cover all of this in my dissertation, you'd get frowny faces from academic advisors. On the other hand, there is somewhat of a dearth out there to draw on in the formal applied psychology literature. So our lit review ended up digging into some of the journals that are less traditional or industrial, organizational, or other applied fields to look at, and ended up focusing more on the neurodiverse literature. So I'd like to share with you some of the nuggets that we learned, and also encourage everyone to continue doing research, and I'll share some tips for best practices before turning things over to Joy. I'm going to give you a quick orientation to these slides. Up in the corner of each of them, you're going to see a little graphic. In this case, this one is green and 1/4 filled full. And each of these represent, to some extent, the volume of the research topic and the quality of the research, with the quality and the applicability to applied settings, to work settings, being reflected in the color, and the volume filled in, representing the volume. This is an imprecise indicator, but hopefully will give you a sense of the ground that's been covered in this so far. I'm also going to go through, kind of in order, application barriers, interviews, personality testing, and COGS for each of the 3 groups that I mentioned. And I'm going to go pretty fast because it's a fair amount of ground to cover. For application barriers for autism, folks with autism, some of the things that can be truly challenging are going back to those job descriptions. A lot of job descriptions have problematically ambiguous language in them. Things like works well with others, or has strong verbal communication. There's a lot of ground to cover within those. Verbal communication can mean I'm doing presentations at EMPA, or it can mean I'm sending emails and coordinating with my work with my supervisor. So what actually is needed for this job? So generic statements may deter very qualified individuals with autism spectrum disorder from applying. In addition, social network, which is often used by people to find roles, may not be a great way for folks with ASD to find jobs, because their networks on average may be smaller. So if one is seeking to be inclusive, one may want to make sure to search very broadly and put the jobs out as far as they can be. There's also some evidence that disclosure of ASD may discourage employer interest during an application process, and an area where we need more research is understanding and educating people so that employers are not discouraged by that, and also how that folks with ASD can safely disclose and get accommodations they need during the hiring process. Next. For ADHD, the research is a little bit more scarce and a little bit less on point in terms of for the workplace. We know that some job search may be hampered with ADHD because folks with ADHD seem to have a little bit of a harder time sustaining their decisions about what career they want to choose, and become anxious about that. We do know on the positive side that ADHD, the hyperactivity symptoms of it, tend to have a positive association with entrepreneurial intentions. There are some famous people who, like Richard Branson, who have disclosed that they have ADHD and clearly have been very successful with entrepreneurs. And there's some evidence of a larger volume quantitative nature that supports the fact that there's more actions taken in entrepreneurial intentions for folks who have hyperactivity symptoms. We know that there's some challenges with folks with ADHD being rated lower on their peers on job applications, and this appears to stem from perhaps having less on point answers. And this is something that may be helpful to study more, how we can help folks in the application process craft applications that really allow them or enable them to show what they're capable of, so their applications are picked. I'll add that the study on this looked at it and said, this doesn't have to do with being inattentive. It's not because like there was more typos on the folks with ADHD's applications versus those with aren't. This has to do something with crafting responses that are viewed favorably and being evaluated by recruiters. This is really interesting because we know that once hired, their job success with people with ADHD can be as high as those of their peers. One interesting study on this was in the US military. There was a stretch in time where folks with ADHD were not admitted to military service. And then there was a period of time that people were given with ADHD were allowed with waivers. And when they looked at the job performance of those admitted to the military on those waivers versus people who had been enrolled in the military through a more traditional process across a huge number of roles, their performance were comparable. And again, this suggests that we need to remove application barriers as well as other barriers because they are falsely limiting people who are capable of performing well in roles. Okay, application barriers for people with dyslexia. Thank you. Interesting study looking at qualitative study, survey study, asking people with dyslexia about why they would not be willing to disclose dyslexia. One was they didn't see it as a work-related disability. They didn't connect it to the workplace. They saw it as an educational thing. That was for some people. And other people feared that they would be discriminated against. On the positive side, college educated with adults with dyslexia or related neurodiversities, such as dysgraphia, appear to be successful at finding jobs if they're college educated and advancing their careers, although sometimes that does take longer. They are successful in professional, technical, or managerial positions with similar education backgrounds. Again, need to better understand some application barriers for folks with dyslexia, but when they are hired, they succeed in those roles. All right, I'm going to switch gears now to interviewing, which Craig mentioned his experiences with. And one of the interesting things here is that there's been a small number of quantitative empirically controlled studies. Many of these studies have focused on training and helping folks with autism do better in terms of interview performance. And that training does seem to improve folks with autism's confidence and the quality or content of their interview responses. But the study that I'm super excited about is this study by Maris, which is the first study and hopefully will be one of many to find out how to quantitatively look at how employers can structure interviews to be more friendly and less disadvantaged to folks with autism. And what they generally found was more structured interviews levels the playing field to some extent. That questions that are things about like, well, what are your strengths? Why should I hire you for this job? Are super challenging, particularly for people who identify as autistic, because they don't understand what they're being asked to provide information about. And so when we do something like a behavioral interview or break down that, what are the strengths into a smaller number of subsets, everybody performs better, and the gap between folks with autism and those who don't identify as autistic is narrowed. This study was also interesting in providing printouts to folks about what questions they were going to be asked, and the majority of people found those printouts helpful. Some did not, and that really is kind of food for thought for both our practice immediately is whether you want to offer that to people. Here's the questions you're going to be asked, or also food for thought for future research on when those printouts would be particularly helpful. Moving on to ADHD and interviews, there are a lot fewer studies here, and this number of the quality of the studies is lower, just smaller sample size and not as relevant to the workplace. But there is some evidence from this study by Fabiano that when interviewers are rating the answers provided by folks with ADHD versus their peers, they may be rated lower on the interviews. So again, a little bit of similarity there to some of the autism research, and this would be a great area for more research to understand how interviews can be shaped and how we can help folks with ADHD do well on interviews. In terms of dyslexia, This was really interesting. This has not been an area that's been researched very much, probably because it's assumed that folks who have dyslexia, it's not a written piece of work. And so why would they perform any better or worse than anybody else on an interview? But what can we infer then? And one of the things that stands out is that self-esteem is generally negatively related to employment interviews. So if you have low self-esteem, you're going to perform worse. And sorry, I think that may be worded poorly. People with low self-esteem do worse on interviews. And on average, individuals with dyslexia have lower self-esteem. And so we might, or we could hypothesize that folks who have dyslexia may be less successful on interviewing, not because of interviewing skills or not being qualified for their jobs, but because of lower self-esteem. So again, ripe area of research that we may be able to be more inclusive in the workplace by learning more about how to use some universal design to make interviews more friendly. All right, I'm going to switch gears now and focus a little bit on personality assessment. You'll notice here that I've got a bigger filled in circle here for research on personality assessment and autism. And the research generally here has been characterized as emerging, and it's generally focused on big five rather than narrower subtraits or facets of big five dimensions. There's been data collected from about 20 studies. The results are very consistent in direction. They vary somewhat in size, and they generally show that on average on the big five, folks with ASD perform on average less favorably than folks who don't have not been diagnosed as having ASD. There are some notable variations by facet, and there's tremendous variability within folks diagnosed with ASD. One of the separate study on this did a cluster analysis identifying common personality profiles with folks with ASD characteristics, identified 4 different types of clusters with various things within those clusters for the big five, some of which were kind of at the norm, no different from a neurotypical sample, and others being quite different. And this variability again suggests we need to be quite specific when we're designing jobs and when we're identifying what is necessary for a job, not to do a blanket, hey, you got to do great on all the big five, but to really think about what characteristics are really necessary for this job. Personality assessment in ADHD has some similarity to the findings on autism. There's been 4 summaries between 2002 and 2021. Individuals diagnosed with ADHD are on average lower on emotional stability and conscientious, and to a lesser extent, agreeableness. There's really too few studies, again, to evaluate moderator effects at this point, although, again, it seems like there may be differences at the facet level, which has not been thoroughly studied, and we need to better understand that space. All right, finally, dyslexia and personality. There's been less research in this area. It seems like that there's relatively few large difference. One of the small differences in studies of college students, which again, not everyone has a college degree, so not clear if this applies in general population or folks who are in college, is that students with dyslexia are higher on emotional stability. And one of the interesting things in this area has been in using visual personality inventories to reduce the reading burden that's placed on folks with dyslexia in personality. So some interesting directions we could go in being more universal in assessing personality. All right, finally moving into COGS. Cognitive ability testing has probably been one of the most research areas because there's been a lot of interest in understanding autism and ADHD and dyslexia in terms of the cognition and the whole neurodiversity behind them. What we understand is that for both autism and ADHD and dyslexia, that they're not universal in the sense of all aspects of cognitive abilities being deficits for all people in any of these neurodiversity groups. One of the things that stands out is for autism that they have working memory, attention, and vigilance. They're on average as strong as those without ASD. Moving on to ADHD. This is one of the really interesting findings, I think, that highlights the diversity within neurodiversity, is that when you look at ADHD and compare them to their peers on executive functions, folks with ADHD perform less well on vigilance, which is the opposite of autism, planning and working memory. And so, again, we need to be cognizant of the fact that neurodiversity in of itself is a very diverse group, and think carefully about what abilities are needed for what roles and what strengths folks can bring to those roles. Finally, taking a quick pass through dyslexia, looking at overall cognitive ability. If tests that rely less on reading ability and phonological processes are used, there's very few differences on general cognitive ability on average between folks with dyslexia and their peers as adults. So to wrap things up, that's a quick pass through the literature. Obviously, I've mentioned multiple times, we have requests for researchers. One of the things that our original goals was, we wanted to understand applicant reactions. We wanted to understand from the neurodiverse community's perspective, what are things that are viewed as particular barriers and what are particular views as enthusiastic. But what we learned was that there was very little research looking at neurodiverse groups in terms of their reactions. There's some qualitative findings, but it would be great to get more studies on understanding what they see as barriers and what they would like to have addressed. We definitely need more quantitative studies of work samples, simulation, and SGATs. Looking forward to Joy's presentation. She's going to be talking a little bit about work samples. We need more research to evaluate the equivalence of multiple modalities of assessments, such as typed answers or recorded answers or video answers to interviews. And we need to know more and investigate the validity of predictors for neurodiverse groups. On the practical side, moving on to the next slide, we really need to focus on work on job descriptions. They're not usually considered a very exciting part of many people's roles, but the more precise and more clear we can be with our job descriptions, the more likely qualified people are going to be encouraged rather than deterred from applying. And the more likely we are going to be able to not accidentally exclude people who are completely qualified for the role that we're wanting to hire them for. We should pursue diverse recruitment strategies. We absolutely need to align our assessment practices with the job requirements and use that granularity that's needed, like using facets of personality and aspects of cognitive ability, not global assessments. And we also really need to promote awareness of and education about neurodiversity. So folks who are in positions of hiring people are not deterred or discouraged about hiring folks who are neurodiverse. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Joy.
All right, Sarah, thank you. Thank you very much. Joy, we will turn it over to you. I don't think I said this up front, but let's put questions in the chat and hold your live questions until the end, and we'll make sure we field those. And Roger, I think, is keeping an eye on the chat. So Joy, over to you.
Thank you. And Sarah, that was a great summary of lots of things. And I love reading research and doing research, so I was just thrilled to listen to it. I want to talk a little bit about autism in the workplace. And I want to reiterate that neurodiversity is a very broad category made up of many subcategories. And Mindshift, specifically when it was formed, chose to focus on autism in the workplace. However, we are becoming more and more cognizant that ADHD, learning disabilities, other types of neurodiversity could be areas for us to continue our work. And I wanted to share a little bit about my son, Kevin, who, as I said, passed away, but he also was a young as a young child, we discovered he had a learning disability, dyslexia, and clearly he managed, and he did have me behind him, helping him go through all of these things. But he was in the military in boot camp, and he was listening to some of the other recruits or enlistees talking about people with disabilities. And he came home and he said to me, man, I do not understand how they can allow people who think about disabilities like that in the military. And I said, well, you didn't like what they said. What did you do? He said, well, I told him my mom works with people with disabilities all the time, and you'd be surprised at all the amazing things they can do if you just give them a chance. And I said, did you tell him that you have a learning disability? He said, hell no. Which I think, just reiterates the fact that people who have neurodiversity often do attempt to mask it in front of other people. So Mindshift recognizes that autism is a cluster of characteristics that are in a spectrum. So they're different with every person, but they generally do involve, in fact, they have to, under the new DSM, have to have stereotype pattern behavior and communication dysfunction. So those two things, and they have to be present at a young age. So what I'm going to do today is talk about a few things through the lens of the workplace, because our goal at Mindshift is to get individuals successfully working within the workplace, knowing all of the things that Sarah spoke to so clearly, that job descriptions are difficult, interviewing is difficult. People who are on the autism spectrum do have a slower processing speed. They do see things in a, it used to be called black and white thinking, but I prefer to call it binary thinking, in O's and ones. And so as we look at all of those and say, how are we going to impact the workforce, the world of work, so that they are willing to bring on individuals who can be very successful and accommodate their needs through universal accommodations. And Mindshift came into being. Go ahead. So the two categories, as I talked, impaired social communication, restricted repetitive behaviors, they can be as much as someone who flicks a pencil like this. I mean, they can be really small. That's like a very minor description, but fortunately, we've gone beyond the time when restricted and repetitive behaviors or stemming aren't immediately thought of as like the head banging kind of behaviors. So sometimes in interviews, for example, you're dealing with someone who is trying to control their repetitive behaviors, and they have impaired social communication and interaction difficulties at the same time. And now you ask them a question that they're not really sure they know the answer to, because they don't know what you're really asking. As Sarah said, think about the challenges that face those people. Go ahead. So let's look at that impaired social communication and interaction. You can read those easily. One of the things that I like to do when I'm having a conversation with the folks that work for Mindshift is I count and I use the pause principle. As an old teacher, yeah. The pause principle is you need to give kids enough pause time to come up with their answer. And I double the pause time for each person who's on the autism spectrum. So typically, if an average person can answer the question in 3 to 5 seconds, then you're going to take twice that much for a person who is on the autism spectrum. And that can be uncomfortable for an interview team unless they're aware that that is something that's necessary. So given enough time, you might get a different answer. That's just a little trick that you can use. And then the relationships, because folks who are on the autism spectrum don't intuitively tune in generally to the body language and eye contact. It is not as meaningful to them. They are going to sometimes look different unless someone has taught them to really focus on eye contact. Remember, if you're doing something that's really unnatural to you, like eye contact, and you've learned to make sure you use eye contact, think about how much energy that person has to expend just to do that eye contact thing. Is that really that important? Next question. Or next question, next slide. So the restricted behaviors, you could read those. They can be I like the insistence on the sameness, because some people say that folks who are on the autism spectrum are very inflexible. That is one way to look at it. But another way is to see that through their lens, which is the sameness or the repetition or the focus that's necessary. Next slide. As far as employment goes, individuals who are on the autism spectrum right now, it's really, you saw that 20% neurodiversity is employed. It's less than that in the governmental recorded statistics, which say about 85% of people who are on the autism spectrum are unemployed or underemployed. And of the 15% who are employed, most of them work 15 hours of a week or less. And if you think about that, that is a great impact on our society and our workforce. So I like to share with our business partners that people who are on the autism spectrum are level 1, 2, or 3. That's the DSM diagnosis. But I like to look at it from how much support do these individuals need. So the impact is significant. Autism it will impact people in their communication and in their need for repetition and sameness. A level 1 person might need some support, 2 moderate, and 3 is substantial. Or when I go to businesses, I say low, moderate, high support needs. Mindshift intentionally was designed as a business to address the needs of individuals with level 1 and level 2 support needs, because there are many other programs and systems in place for people who have the severe and high needs. Go ahead. Yep. And then we'll hear the question, can these people work part-time? Absolutely they can, but they can also very likely work full-time, and they likely, if they're well prepared and the business has prepared well and is open to universal designs, a level 1 ASD person would have some to moderate support needs, and many times none, especially as they get used to and become more comfortable in the environment. So that is a way that businesses become more comfortable knowing that, yes, there are support needs. I also share with businesses that when a person is under a lot of stress, they likely are going to perform less than their capabilities. And we all are like that. If we're really stressed out going into an environment, we're not going to be performing our best. So I try to share that with businesses, that if they are going to have an unexpected change, prepare the person who's on the spectrum to say, hey, so-and-so is your manager now. They put in for a change. They're going to be moving to a different department in 2 weeks. That is very helpful for someone who's on the autism spectrum. Go ahead. So again, when you look at the task requirements, non-repetitive creative tasks mixed with repetitive and structured tasks. Yes, a person can do that. The level 1 people can do all of those things. Level 2 people, it depends on the person, and that goes back to the spectrum disorder. Level 3, that would be much more challenging for a level 3 person. So looking at the spectrum of people, we have a lot of people who can do those things. I often get asked by businesses, can they adapt to sudden changes? Yes, because we prepare our people before they come to work to you to know that that may happen within the workplace. The workplace can have unexpected changes, and we provide our people with some strategies and tools to deal with that. Go ahead. So what are some of the challenges somebody who is autistic may face in the workplace? Social challenges. For one, because work typically, and I'd like to see some research on this, Sarah, if you guys are interested in it, but what I see anecdotally and through my experience in life, people who are on the autism spectrum do not generally have, if they have a 4-year degree, the internship part of that degree is something that they've been pretty inexperienced or sometimes unsuccessful, because they haven't really heard that if you have an internship, it's not going to be something you sign up for. You usually have to do some work to get that. And we also see that folks do not enter the workforce then until they're in their mid-20s. And they may have gone to college, they may have gotten several degrees because that's something they've learned how to operate in, but entering the workforce is difficult. So regular work hours can be a challenge. Small talk and pleasantries, just a quick little story. One of the first young men that I worked with at when I started with Mindshift, we were talking about small talk, and I was coaching the group that, what would you do if you walked in the building, you saw the same person every day, and one day the person said, "Hey, did you see the Vikings play?" And that my young man said, "Well, I just walk away." And I said, "Why would you do that?" And he said, "Well, for number one, I don't even care about the Vikings. I'm not going to answer him." So then we had a conversation about how could you respond to someone to be more approachable, who's trying to engage you in a conversation. "Hey, how about those Vikings?" "Well, I don't really follow football, but what I do is I play this video game. What do you know about that?" And so coaching people and people in the business to understand those lack of need really for the small talk that a lot of folks on the spectrum have. And then you can read through some of those if you have questions about them. Feel free to put something in the chat. I want to talk about speaking the truth, though. A lot of folks, and this is a real example of an individual I worked with in autism, with Mindshift. He was working at a business and he was getting very frustrated. The business called me, and he also called me and said, things aren't going well right now. So at the time I was working at as the employment services manager. So I hopped in my car and drove to the business, and I asked to meet with the young man, and I said, "What's going on?" And he said, "Oh, they asked me to do something that just makes no sense at all." And he used a swear word. And I said, "You didn't say that to the manager, did you?" And he said, "No." And I said, "That's good." But he wanted to. That was the thing. That's when he called me. He wanted to. Now, if you swear at a manager, it's probably not a good thing, and it could result in a termination. But this particular business said, "We recognize the anxiety and stress, and we're going to call Mindshift because that's part of what we do, is the coaching of both the business and the individual." Go ahead. Task challenges. Sarah mentioned in the job descriptions, clear, concise, and eliminating ambiguity is going to produce better results. And most people would say an ambiguous task is more difficult for everybody, but it's especially difficult for people who are on the autism spectrum. Another thing is getting too many instructions, not having those written questions. I was really happy to hear that it's an option to have those interview questions ahead of time. That really is helpful, even in jobs. When we go out into the workforce, one of my first questions is, do you have a description of the process for the job? Some businesses say, no, we don't. We just tell them, do you mind if we write it down? And so that we have the process articulated in writing for individuals. And in some individuals, we coach them also to ask if they can write down the directions. And you get far better results when a person has that frame of reference. And I would challenge you that many people would do better if they had that going to the universal accommodations. Go ahead. But we also focus on the strengths that the individual brings to the workplace. And surprisingly, and again, I'd like to see more research on this too, but my observations are people who are on the autism spectrum actually are, and neurodiverse people in general, are actually really pretty good problem solvers because they have to solve their own problems as they work through the world of work. So that's something we can focus on. The attention to detail, if they're really interested in something, they can stay with it forever. One young man that I worked with, super interested in spreadsheets. That was his thing. And once we found we could tap into that in the business that he's working with, he became their Excel expert. They said, bar none, he was more knowledgeable about Excel than anyone else in the company. It was a pretty big company as well. Next one. So other strengths, let's just click on that slide a couple times and you'll see a few things. A perseverance, tenacity, loyalty, a rule follower, look for the results rather than the beginning, can learn really in-depth information. And some research, I'd like to see more here, is the productivity tends to increase as much as 140% just by bringing in a few people who are neurodiverse. And I think part of it is our work environments sometimes are more social than they need to be. And individuals, if you're on your team, if there are one or two people that just don't tune into that social side of work, then everybody's probably a little more productive. Be nice to see some research there. Okay, so tying in with that, you can read that slide. People stay, they don't turn over. We know that turnover is costly to businesses and decreases a lot of things. That's really good. And I think the other piece of it that's really important is when coworkers see that a business is open to neurodiversity, they become less anxious about their own potential challenges within the workplace. And I have seen businesses where people have watched mind shift specialists working and then said, I think I feel comfortable, or can you help with our manager that of the team I'm working on? So inclusive hiring practices, Sarah did a great job about talking about that. But I'll just go through a couple of things because we do work with businesses on this, and that's educate, 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 start talking about the discussions, revisit harassment and bullying, because some people sometimes have assumptions that a person with a disability is someone who can be bullied, and we know there's no tolerance to that. Next one. Simplify the job posting. Absolutely. State that you're a neurodiverse employer. Absolutely. Accommodations can be requested. Absolutely. Waive previous experience in post-secondary credentials unless they're absolutely required. But I see a lot of job postings that say 5 years experience and master's degree. Is that really a part of the job requirement? If it is, okay, but a lot of times it's not. And our folks who are on the spectrum will take themselves out of the pool if they see 5 years of work experience and they don't have that, or they don't have that master's degree. And then look at proof of abilities. So I've started doing this with a lot of the businesses that I work with, and that is saying, yes, you need to have confidence this individual can do the job, but can we give him a scenario or an opportunity to solve a problem? And so it's evidence based on what he can do or she can do based instead of the answers to the interview questions. Go ahead. So partner with autism experts and know that you're on a learning curve. That's absolutely important. And work through sourcing in non-traditional channels. I think Craig talked about that a little bit too, and Sarah as well, you know, cast a wide net, because people who are neurodiverse are out there. It's a matter of inviting them into the environment. Interviewing, we talked about that. I'm not going to focus on that too much. You can read it. Next one. Retention practices. That's another thing that Mindshift does. We're in essence a staffing agency. That's really what we do. So we work with businesses. We come in as a supplier of talent, and as part of their engagement with us, we work both with the individual before they're hired and once they're hired, and the businesses at the same time. So post-hire, which means they work for us and as a contractor that they would, we give them lots of information. We make sure they have an understanding of what they will get when they go into the onboarding process with the business, because we've also talked to the business at the same time and prepared them for the individual who's coming in. Go ahead. And then retention, that's really important. And that means long-term, how are you going to work with an individual based on their individual needs? You might need to allow an individual to have flexible breaks. You know, one thing that I noticed with COVID is people have, in lots of industries, have become a little more flexible about things like that. And that's a good thing. We provide coaching both for the employee and the stakeholder, the clients. We make sure that they have specifics on what kind of metrics are being used to evaluate their positions. And we work with both the business during performance reviews and for the individual, and we also give the individual performance reviews. So some helpful tips for this group and for businesses and community. Be curious about a person, try to understand the person and that, and be open to what their answers are, how they describe themselves. Also question your own assumptions and biases. Then that's kind of that boot camp story. You know, those people who were disparagingly talking about people with disabilities, they could have questioned their assumptions and it might have been a different outcome. Step out of your comfort zone. Just because you don't know about autism, you won't know about it until you start learning about it. And then internalize and listen to, internalize what you hear, actively listen and be willing to learn. Thank you.
All right, Joy, thank you. Thank you. So, so Sarah provided sort of a research perspective. Joy provided a view of her vast experience with Mindshift out at multiple organizations. So Mary's going to talk a little bit about just what we've done here at Korn Ferry. We've kind of not so much about what we're out doing with clients, but what we're doing internally to put a toe in the water in this area.
Great, thanks, Craig. So if you want to go ahead and advance. So what I'm going to talk about today is really the partnership that we've had with Mindshift. So I want to give you an idea of what this really felt like and what really happened from a very tactical perspective with our relationship with Mindshift. So we had the opportunity to listen to Joy and team come to Korn Ferry, talk a little bit about the work that they do. And I was really struck by two things. One was this focus on what are the unique strengths of people on the spectrum. I think a lot of times those of us who have spent a lot of years in assessment, we get really used to this idea of looking for deficiencies or, what are the areas that people need to improve. So I was really struck by that. And then I was also struck by this idea of using unique strengths to solve business problems. So after listening to Joy and team come and present, and then Craig, if you want to advance. One of the things that came up in our organization that I'm sure many of you on the phone have had experience with is a really sort of perplexing business problem. As everybody gets into big data, you've got a lot of data, it sits on a lot of different platforms. We have a particular client that literally have hundreds of thousands of data points sitting in different places in the organization that needs to be pulled, it needs to be cleaned, it needs to be transformed, it needs to be put all in a singular location to give the client some access to this data. So it's a really high sort of attention to detail, need for high quality, somebody that can stay really focused for long periods of time without getting bored or distracted. And so as we talked about this, we reflected on some of the things that Joy had talked to us about at Mindshift. And then Craig, if you want to advance, and really described the issue to them that we were facing with us and really questioned, might this be a good place for us to partner based on some of the things that we have heard? And so one of the things that we really appreciated from the very beginning was Joy and team just talking about the very team-based approach that they took. So, it's really about working with a specialist, which is an individual who's on the spectrum, but there would also be a Mindshift employee relationship manager who would work with us to help to onboard us as an organization, to ensure that we got the right talent for the business need that we had, to help us with onboarding, to help us with coaching and developing, and then to also just help us prepare the environment to help the specialist be successful in helping us meet our business needs. And then there would be a Korn Ferry manager. So from the beginning, yep, go ahead, Craig, it's just fine to move on. In the partnership, we sat down with Mindshift. We did a lot of work to help them understand the job. They asked a lot of those questions, a lot of the same things that Joy has talked about. What exactly needs to be done? What is documented? What's the environment like? What are the skills that you need? They also shared with us, they do a lot of sorts of work together to do some of those real life job samples from people. So really put our mind at ease that the person that would be on the job with us would have those really kinds of technical skills that we needed. And we also got really clear about what are those pieces that we don't need. Like we really don't need a lot of social interaction for this job. The communication skills we need can be in writing. They can be just really kind of clear and succinct. But it forced us to get very precise in understanding the job ourselves and be really clear about what we needed and what we didn't need. And then Craig, if you want to advance. So after talking with Mindshift, they had someone in mind that they thought really met all of those qualifications. And then we sat down for a joint interview and discussion. And it was a very transparent interview. So it was with the specialist, it was with the employment relationship manager as well. And then it was with myself and then the individual on my team who was going to directly manage the specialist. And we really had a good dialogue around what the job was, providing a realistic job preview, also really transparent dialogue from Mindshift and the specialist around, hey, here's the kinds of places I'm really successful. Here's how I learn. Here's how I need to get instructions. Here's where I've really struggled. So really nice. It just really brought it to life for us. Like, what's it going to take for this individual to be successful? And what do we need to do to prepare that environment? And then we could also be really clear and direct and transparent around what we're going to be some of the struggles with the job and what we're going to be some of the perhaps motivating factors for the role as well. At the conclusion of the discussion, we agreed it was a good relationship, or it seemed to be a very good fit in terms of skills and what we needed for the job. And then we engaged in a lot of onboarding planning. And again, going back to a lot of those things that Joy's already talked about, but how do we document the process? How are we going to communicate? How often are we going to meet? What do we do if there's an issue? And yep, it's fine, Craig. You can keep moving there. It's fine. And I think one of the most valuable parts of that work was really the communication coaching that we received. So with this particular specialist, one of the things we knew that this individual was very, very literal, so very concrete in his messaging. So it was really about asking those open-ended questions to get the kind of information that we needed, It was also understanding what modes of communication work best for him, how often, creating a really predictable communication schedule, and then also having regular kinds of feedback, not only with the specialist, but also with the employment relationship manager as well. So we could get on top of any issues before they really became an issue. And I'll tell you just a kind of a quick anecdote around this. When we did get the feedback about this specialist being very concrete, for example, we thought, okay, we have it. We're going to document all these things. We're going to be really organized, very clear. And one thing we didn't even think about in the level in the work that we were doing was literally we were asking this individual to match some names. And so he literally was matching names. So if there was a Michael Smith and a Mike Smith, those are two names that wouldn't be matched. So I think it's just one of those things that caused us to just really back up and take some of that communication coaching to heart. And again, just kind of rethink some of the way that we organized ourselves and the way that we communicated. All in all, it forced us to slow down and get quite precise in the work that we did. And then Craig, if you want to advance. So all of the things Joy talked about as well, I think we've really seen here, we've seen incredibly high quality work output from our specialists. We've been incredibly happy with the quality. You can see that attention to detail pulling through. We've seen big efficiency gains for most more neurotypical individuals. We believe they wouldn't be able to concentrate on a task that is, just this detail oriented for this long, for this extended period of time. Also just a nice and open and transparent discussion across the board. What's working, what isn't, what do we need to improve upon? And we found really good motivation and engagement for both parties. And we continue to brainstorm for other ways to partner. And I think one of the pieces we've learned here too is all of the things that we've done here are really helpful for our team and also just helpful for neurotypical individuals. Slowing down, communicating clearly, being really clear at what we're all good at, being more clear about where we struggle and what we need to be successful, and having very transparent conversations as well. So really across the board, that headline around the importance of good communication backed up by good organization, clarity, and transparency. And then Craig, if you want to advance. So here, I don't think really much in here that no one in this group hasn't talked about already, but really thinking about diversity in terms of including neurodiversity. I don't think a lot of us think about that in the workplace. I think, we have more traditional perhaps definitions of diversity, but really thinking about neurodiversity and the tweaks that, we probably need to make to help neurodiverse individuals be successful, which I think a lot of this discussion today and a lot of what we've learned just comes down to being really clear about what the job is and what you need, what you actually don't need for the job. And then helping businesses really understand how this unique talent pool can help them meet goals. I mean, you really are going to get a really different, in some cases, very different and very unique skill set that you're not going to get in the neurotypical population that can help you solve some of those very specific goals. And then also just the success that you can have by helping other people who are smarter in this space than you help you. There's a lot of people out there who know a lot about working with neurodiverse individuals. So really tapping into organizations and individuals who are more informed help you speed that onboarding and transition process. And Craig, I think that's the last one, but let me know if there's one after that. Oh, yep, that's it.
That is it. Well, thanks, Joy. Thanks, Korn Ferry team. Let's see, Roger, I wasn't monitoring the chat because I didn't want to screw things up. So any questions there in the chat that you think would be good ones to sort of start off a short Q&A?
Yeah, nothing actually came up, but you did have Allison chime in, sharing her experience with neurodiversity in her workspace as well. From your initial questions about midway through.
Yeah.
Other than that, all's quiet.
So please let's just spend a minute or two. Come off mute if you have questions for any of the presenters. Please do.
I have a question. Have any of you found any differences between men and women when it comes to autism and how that affects their work? Sorry.
Hi.
Hey. We're-
First of all, the number of males who are identified as on the autism spectrum, I think is 1 out of, I won't give you the numbers because I don't have them right off my head, but they're like, women are 4 times less likely to be identified as on the autism spectrum. And so that's really interesting. And we've been we've been looking in MindShift saying generally we have more men than women working for us. But lately, I think we are starting to tap into the female population. And what I see is females, perhaps, depending on how they were brought up, as well as, it's a spectrum, so nobody's exactly the same, tend to maybe mask more deeply than the guys do. And I'm sort of surprised that the statistics are staying where they are. As far as work performance, I do not see any difference. A female who's working on a job and she's on the autism spectrum will, and it's the right job and she's the right person for the job, she will be as successful as male. So I think it's more of a perception problem from the diagnostic side and from our population expectations than abilities.
Sarah, anything from our research to add to that?
Yeah, one of the interesting things was in a lot of the research that disproportion of men and women is not seen. And from talking about with some academics who are more used to seeing kind of who shows up for studies, part of the impression was that generally more women volunteer to participate in research studies than men. And so in a lot of the studies where I might have been concerned, like, are these results like we see in some medical studies, oh, it only reflects one population. There's a lot in the literature that's reflecting a lot of the studies included almost equal proportions of men and women who are autistic. So the research findings I shared, I think are fair to say apply generally to both men and women who identify as neurodiverse.
Okay, and then I know, Joy, you said something about masking. I have been reading a little bit about autism, and some things that I've found is that women tend to be really good at masking kind of their autistic symptoms, maybe. I don't know. Would you say that's true?
My experience has been that. I mean, even when I was in the school systems, there are many more boys, males than females. And then in MindShift, I've seen the same thing. And the first group of individuals I worked with had a young lady, and she was really good. I asked her once, because she always asked me how my day was, she did the small talk kind of thing. And I was like, I appreciate that. Tell me, how did you discover that you should do it? And she said, well, my mom told me I should always start a conversation with something like that. So, she tried to build the expectations into her lifestyle. And I think women sometimes do that more than men. I have 4 brothers, so I can say that maybe.
I think one of the things we learned at SciAp too, that I went to a presentation, is that women tend to get diagnosed later in life too, probably due to the masking. And so then they're not getting that kind of early intervention that more boys are, or, more males are. So there's just not that opportunity to build in that intervention earlier either for women. And so I know there was kind of a call for practitioners and clinicians to really think about how do those behaviors show up differently in the different genders as well. So some of those things can be earlier intervention for women.
And do you think with the masking that some women might not even know if they are autistic? And how could we help? If so, how could we help or how can we intervene in the fact that some women who are autistic in the workplace and don't know it could be learning a lot better through certain accommodations. And has anyone thought about that, I guess?
I think for me anyway, one of the ways when we're in the workplace and we wonder if someone perhaps we can do our own check, like the communication part. There will be some kind of expressive or receptive or both communication challenges, and they might show up in oral language, they might show up in written language, they might show up in both. And so, if you're wondering, one of the things that you can do, I used to do this when I was in the classroom, was do that pause principle test, because one of the things we know is processing speed tends to be slower. So if you're wondering and a person's getting really stressed, are you really giving, you can do a count in your head, count to 10, give them time to frame their answer. And if you are observing, you can see people that, just bombard a person constantly without giving them the 10 seconds. What do you think that their anxiety is going to increase? So their behavior is going to decrease. So you can start checking it that way. And then I think, especially in the world today, to have a conversation, if you're doing a performance review, saying, I've noticed that you really, it seems like you really need a little more time to answer a question. Is that something that's helpful to you? I mean, you can frame your performance review using those kinds of things.
Bill has
looks like Bill has a question.
Yeah, Bill has a question. Thank you, Joy. Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, a couple of things running through my mind here. I'm listening to you talk about management from a particular perspective, where you're considering your employees as resources, not to be exploited, but to be developed.
Right.
And if you take that kind of an approach, I think you're really driving home how important it is for managers to know each of their individual employees rather than treating them all the same. Very different from an extraction or exploitation type of approach to doing your business. Any thoughts about that?
Well, my thought is, I'll jump in and then please, Korn Ferry too. It's like, it's really important for all people to see themselves as a valuable resource. And when I know I'm going into a workplace that sees me that way, I'm immediately going to be a better person, even though I might have my own challenges, my own struggles, but I know that the manager sees me as somebody a valuable contributing member of the team.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Joy. I think a contributing, valuable member of the team. I also think there's an element of this that I think a lot about. I think, again, probably coming from that assessment perspective, but we spend so much time saying, like, where don't people match up versus what are the really unique strengths that the person brings to this job, and how can we tweak the job to meet the needs of the person, but still get the kinds of results that we need. I think that's one thing that, working with Mindshift has really made me rethink a lot, is how, and they're tiny little tweaks, right? They're not huge things with huge benefits. So also, how are we being flexible in our jobs? How are we being flexible in our organizations? How are we being flexible in our expectations? And then I think both ways can benefit, right? The organization and the individual benefit. And that's really what we're looking for in any kind of person job fit, is that mutual positive outcomes for each side of the equation.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So Randy has a question in the chat. What steps should an employer take to accommodate a candidate who discloses their neurodiversity prior to or after taking an assessment? We have a
Go ahead.
I will just start the ball rolling and say it should be tailored to that person and their neurodiversity. That we know, even looking at autism, that's a spectrum, and each neurodiversity has its own needs and challenges. And so one of the things that should be asked is, well, what accommodations would be helpful to you?
I'll give you an example. My son, again, when he was young, and like I said, he's not on the autism spectrum, but he was very much learning disabled. When he was taking his spelling tests, he would get 100% wrong every time, even though we studied and studied and studied. But he was very dyslexic. Well, you can imagine his morale went down to the bottom because he couldn't even get one right, no matter how he studied. So I went into the classroom and I said to the teacher, okay, let's try this differently. If he can get the first and the last letter right of the word, he can start using spell check. And then we went to first two letters and the last letter. And at least then he can do the spell check, and he will, if he gets the first and last letter right for the first month, then count it as correct, because that's his goal. And the teacher agreed to do that. You should have seen when he came home and got 19 out of 20 right, his morale went up, and he could spell check it because he could pick from a selection of words the right word that he meant, that he needed for his language. So just a simple little accommodation like that can make a huge difference in a person's view of themselves and the classroom or the work community, and allow people to use the spell check. And I mean, it's not as much a big deal as it was when he was in grade school. Spell check was kind of taboo, but my gosh, what would I do without spell check, right?
Yeah. And I would say very practically, one of the things that we do is we will say to people come in for an assessment, we'll say, what accommodations would be helpful to you? And sometimes you have people that say, yep, here's the things I need. We say, great, we can accommodate you that way. Sometimes you have people that say, I don't really know. And then just having a sort of things in our back pocket, here's things we found before that people have asked for accommodations, with this particular neurodiversity, for example. So the way we handle it is typically just very one-off, asking what they want, and then also saying, here's some other things that we've seen that are helpful. Are those helpful to you? If people don't have a really clear sense themselves of what they're looking for.
Mm-hmm. And an oral answer versus something that's written, or if it has to be written, give them a day to craft their answer rather than expecting them to on the spot craft it. I mean, like Sarah said, just tiny little things that can make a difference. And for a person who doesn't know, you can ask them what, if you had your choice, how would you prefer to deal with this situation?
All right. Anything else? Well, Roger, I think we'll pause there. Does it make sense?
Yeah, great session, great content. Also the first time we've gotten anywhere close to neurodiversity, much less in the workplace or in a selection setting. So I'm excited to keep trudging forward and exploring new subject matter with the IMPOC community here. And I appreciate the contribution of Craig, Joy, Sarah, Mary, and Korn Ferry and Mindshift stepping up here to be able to provide their perspective as well.
I don't know if we have time. It looks like Tim has a question in the chat, Roger.
Yep. If you guys want to take a swing at the ball, I can toss it here.
Yeah, do you see this one? Do you have the
I
chat
see
up?
it.
What have you seen?
I
Trends
got it.
over the last 3 years, shifts.
I've seen
Joy,
a
why don't
lot
you
in the
take that
work. I've seen a lot in the workplace, because 3 years ago, I would be knocking on doors trying to get contracts with businesses. And for the first time this year, I am getting incoming calls with businesses saying, hey, what can you do? And so that's pretty cool. And I'm also seeing businesses say, hey, we want to have we want people who are neurodiverse across our facility, not just one or two people here and there. So it is changing, and that is a good thing.
Yeah, good. All right. Well, thank you, Paul. We appreciate this opportunity to talk about this important topic. And Roger, good to hear that this is kind of a novel topic. Probably more to come over the years. So,
We'll make space.
all right.
Thanks for joining, everybody.
Thank you. Have a wonderful
you.
evening.
Take good care. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Craig, Joy, and Sarah.